Hello, everyone, and welcome to another The Biblical Perspective. And we're actually carrying on from last week. Does the Bible condone slavery? But before we go into it, I'm going to have a word of prayer because we know it's part 2, don't we? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us back here again this week for another Biblical Perspective. Does the Bible condone slavery? Lord, it's only from your word that we are going to know the truth about this, not from the minds of man, because man didn't create any man, but you did. So I pray that as the Holy Spirit leads Colleen, myself, Pedro, and Simon, that the viewers will get a more concise and more understandable regard to what you think about slavery. So I pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. So we know it's part 2, and we are going to do an intro for you to recap from part 1.
So there are many places in the Bible where you can actually look at it and say, there we go. This is
I can't hear it, Simon.
the Bible condoning slavery. The types of slavery that we're thinking about and what the Bible is talking about are two different things. And the context of that is that of people who willingly chose for their own reasons. It could be because they fell on hard times. They lost their property. Because we've already seen that God does not condone abuse of any kind, particularly to the foreigner. Telling Israel, remember you were a foreigner and what happened to you. I don't want you to represent me to a foreigner the same way. So the difference is in how long the foreigner can serve and how long the Israelite can serve. The Israelite abided by the law that God gave them. For instance, you will work for 6 years, and the 7th year, you could be redeemed, you could be free. But as for the foreigner, he is not under this. He can choose to serve from generation to generation. This is the context, and that needs to be clear. Now, does that mean that God has originated this plan? Absolutely not. When God gave all these laws and statutes and commandments to the children of Israel, he was giving them guidance as to how to operate within a society or societies that had customs and practices.
Okay.
We missed out the first part of that video with the sound.
Okay, but it was nice that we were able to actually do a recap. But thank you very much, Pedro, for that. So viewers, as we know, it's always good that we do this because we may have forgotten things from last week or misconstrued things from last week. So this week we're going to go into part 2, as we said, and hopefully we'll get a richer, more deeper understanding of does the Bible condone slavery. I'll be answering your questions and comments, and Colleen, leading on from last week, will be asking the questions. So Colleen, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. So, Pedro, we recap some of the key points that you discussed last week, and part of the section of the video that was missing that we weren't able to recap was when we actually said last week that we had looked at a portion of text from the Bible, which, when you read them outside of its context, indicates or sounds as though that that the Bible somehow does condone slavery, looking at those texts. And we then went on to explain that it's within a different context and so forth. So I'm hoping that we can continue to build on the points that we discussed last week. So I wanted to do that by just going straight into the questions so that we can actually continue from last week. Or if there are any key points that you do want to recap on, then please do so. So continue on with the question. So the question that I wanted to ask, so that we can continue on from last week, is based on everything that we've done last week and on the previous video, can we say that the Bible does not condone slavery in spite of the text that we read? And the reason why I do ask this is because you know, a lot of people have used the Bible in the past to condone slavery, and some people actually still do. So there is that that tension in the Bible with the text that we did discuss that does almost appear that the Bible does condone slavery. And, you know, we have discussed that this actually is not the case. So how do we then move on from this point?
I don't think that we have concluded on this because we were still in the process of examining the context of those texts. What we did was to present those texts being used, and we did say, and this was something that was missing from the recap, that those texts were used to by European slave masters
Yes.
to keep under subjection millions of men, women, and children from African countries whom they had bought, they had hunted down, they had captured, they had kidnapped, they had stolen, and whom they had worked literally to death over generations. This part was missing. And another part that is key, in my opinion, that was missing is when we ask the question, how do we end up in a situation like this? We did say we end up in a situation like this because, first of all, there is confusion of, subject. The kind of slavery we have in mind when we read those texts is the slavery that happened over the last centuries, and more specifically, the slave trade from Africa to Europe and the Caribbean, America, and so on and so forth. And that is a completely different subject from what we have in the Bible. And the text that we have in the Bible were used to justify that latter part of the historical experience of mainly people from Africa taken as slaves by European powers. Now, I wanted to revisit those texts and explain how we ended up in this situation. The first thing was we like to pick and choose, as I said last time, what we want, what is convenient to us. That causes us to sometimes completely ignore context. And at that particular junction, when we do that, we can go into any direction that we choose to and feel justified about it. That's one. So I want to go back and reestablish the context of every one of those texts that we looked at. The first one was Leviticus chapter 25, verses 45 and 46. And there was somebody who was adamant that we needed absolutely to include verse 44. And I did say, the way I'm going about it, I will not do it now. I will talk about it later. And you can check the video to see if what I'm saying is true. Now, I am going to introduce this verse 44 now, but before I do that, let me establish the context of the whole passage. And I also said that the context begins with verse 39 of Leviticus chapter 25. So if you want to read that for me, I would be grateful.
Okay, and Leviticus 25:39 and King James Version, and it says, "If thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bond servant." And the New Living Translation, "If one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave." And Revised Standard Version, "And if your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave."
Thank you very much. So what you observe in the two last versions is the subject is very clear and the condition is well stated, not as clear as in the King James. So in the New Living Translation, the Revised Standard Translation, you clearly see that the person who gets into servitude here has decided to do that willingly. Why? Because of falling on hard times. They sell themselves to other people. And we did say, in this case, this is the fellow Israelite selling himself to another, the Israelite selling himself to another fellow Israelite. But the reason why I took this text to begin in establishing the context is because it is the first text in the whole passage of chapter 25 that speaks about to be sold into slavery. And the end of it is the end of the chapter in verse 55. So I heard somebody, or I read somebody made the comment that verse 39 has absolutely nothing to do with the verses of interest, which were 44, 45, 46. But I invite everyone to look into this for themselves. And I'm restating the reason why I believe that the context of this selling of slaves and enslavement begins there. Because the whole chapter 25 speaks about different things. But when it comes to the passage about selling, buying, and enslaving, it begins with 39 and ends with 55. Therefore, in the middle, you have these texts and the context is defined. Now, what we see, let me introduce now 44 in this passage. What 44 is doing is to say, who are these people whom you can have bond servant from? Which is the people who could be slave beyond 6 years, beyond 50 years, the people who could be slaved, bought and sold, still within the context of they offer themselves in order to get themselves out of difficult times to other people, foreigners who would be amongst Israel. If you want to check this, all you need to do is to check the chapter that says the strangers who live among you. Somebody said these people were captive of war. Well, read the chapter for yourself and find out for me if you find that information there, or if you don't find the information about selling themselves. So that's one thing. Now, what 44 says is from the nations around, the people who are not concerned with the commitment that Israel has to God in keeping the law of God. Therefore, they're not subject to the 6 years of servitude, and they have to be free the 7th year or the 50th year. these people would be those who would go beyond. But as for the Israelites, they can't go beyond. Why? Because God cannot afford having a people. God has an idea in his head. God has a plan. He wants people to know when you come under him, you come under freedom. You cannot be in your situation like you were before, in servitude, in slavery. And that's why he always speaks about, I took you out of the house of bondage to make you my people, so that you can be a blessing to others. That's the theme the Bible runs with: deliverance from slavery. And it begins historically with Israel. So that's the context. We established also that God does not condone abuse of the foreigner. Now, if the foreigner is going to sell himself into slavery in order to get out of difficult situation, actually that was a form of duty on the part of the Israelites to care for these people. And they could attach themselves to that family to care for them for generations if they wanted to. That's the whole context. Now, I want you to read again what God says about the same foreigner, the same stranger amongst the Israelites in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 to 19, please.
For the Lord your God is God of gods, and the Lord, sorry, let me go back again. For the Lord your God is God of gods, and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the terrible God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt.
The sojourner that you hear about here is the same foreigner or stranger that you find right within the passage, the whole chapter 25 of Leviticus, but also within the passage we're concerned with concerning the slavery. So you will have an impossible task to reconcile unless you have discredited the Bible in your own mind. You will have a very hard time to find anywhere where God says to Israel that he can or they can abuse the stranger. In fact, you will find, and we've read it, many places where he says, and right here, he says, you shall love the foreigner. And I'm not one who favors people over other people. I'm not a respecter of person, or I'm not a partial. I do that which is right. So you are going to treat the foreigner with the same love and kindness that you would treat anybody else, because that's about me. You're supposed to reflect my character. So right here, you can see that there is a contrast that is quite clear between the treatment of these people who would have sold themselves willingly into slavery so that they could be taken care of, with what happened to people from Africa from the 16th century. The contrast is stark. There was no love. There was no care. There was nothing of the sort that God is saying the children of Israel have to demonstrate to the foreigner. So clearly, these are two different things that we cannot reconcile. In fact, if the people who enslaved other people from Africa had read those texts and believed in it, first of all, they would not go and hunt them down and capture them and kidnap them and steal them, because that's not the context in which people were serving as. And while I'm here, let me say, because somebody was talking about the Greek word and the Hebrew word. Paul used one word because he was talking in one language, and the word in the Old Testament, the Hebrew, is another one. They are not the same. I advise this person to go, and everybody else to just check what is the equivalent of doulos in Hebrew, and what's the equivalent of eved in the Greek. Just go to the Old Testament, what we call the LXX or the Septuagint, and check for yourself, and you will realize that doulos has the exact same meaning, depending on context, than eved or eved, if you want to be proper, in Hebrew. So that's not an issue at all. Now, this is the Old Testament, and the context again is about caring for people regardless. The difference
Pedro,
is not about, yes?
there's a comment here by EJ, and they're saying, in what context is this talking about the same type of foreigner as the foreigner who sells himself becomes property and no longer has personhood? The difference is you are discussing a free man who is a foreigner and not property. But I think
I
it's
would
more
love
about,
to know.
yeah.
I would love to know how we make the difference in those two words. No, I'm not discussing a free man. The context again, I'm establishing the context 39. Please understand that. The context in with verse 39 is established by saying if somebody sells himself into
Mm,
slavery. Of course, it begins with the Israelites, but it's applicable to the foreigner. And the context is if that person falls on hard time and that person wants a way out, that person can do that. And God is telling to the Israelites, you can do that for life if somebody wants to do that. And elsewhere, we even have, let me leave that aside. It's not about free man and bondman. It's about somebody, that's the context, who sells himself or herself into slavery or servitude. Is that clear?
Pedro, I think I've got another comment here. Just before you go on to what you're saying, it's by Purple Light Touch, Valerie, I would presume. The slaves in Egypt wanted to go back to Egypt rather than go to the promised land. The African slaves had nowhere to go but death by sea and slavery.
Mm.
I
Well,
think I was clear from the beginning to say that these
yeah,
Yeah,
people were enslaved and they were
yeah,
worked literally to death and
yeah,
for generations. And there is no way you can reconcile that with anything you have in the Bible.
yeah. And
No
also,
way.
as well, we have previously said, and we keep on saying this, that the slavery that we are familiar with and the slavery that we saw in the European slave trade is totally different than what God is speaking about in His Word. When we talk about this slavery, it's a slavery where individual chose to go into slavery or servanthood, if you want to call it by another word, in order to get themselves to a better place, to pay off their debt. Maybe they'd lost property, maybe they had, something had happened and they'd lost everything. So it's two different things. They chose to go into slavery. And also, after a certain time, depending if they were an Israelite, they would be let free from that slavery, maybe after, like, on the 7th year or on the 50th year of the of that
Jubilee.
particular Jubilee. But for the foreigner, they could choose to go beyond that period. So they chose that, and they could choose not to. So it's a different type of slavery. It's totally different. I think the problem is that when we think of slavery, we only see the slavery that we know and understand. But what we're talking about in the Bible is something totally different.
Okay, thank you, Colleen, for that, and that's correct. And let me because we will need to close that today. The problem also people have is the word "they will be your property or possession."
Yeah.
Well, this word in the Bible, if you look at it, even within chapter 25, God says, for instance, in verse 23, God says, I give you the land of Canaan, the land of milk and honey. That's your possession. But you know what? That land is not yours. Therefore, you can't sell it. It has to return to the person to whom I gave it to after 50 years. If that person sold himself or herself or her property or his property, after 50 years, you have to let it go. The bigger picture in that is God was addressing the issue of freedom that he has pursued from the time sin entered the world. To say to these people, there will not be any control forever of situations that are reminiscent of or produced by evil eventually. This is the plan God is, and that's why those who had covenanted with God, like the Israelites, God would not allow them even against their own will. And God, there was also a law that says, when the time comes and you send these people away, after 6 years, you send these people away and they don't want to go away because they want to serve you. Why would they want to serve you? They don't want to serve you, but the law says they have to go away. Then what you need to do is to pierce their ear.
That's right.
And to make a sign that they will then serve you forever, because they wanted to serve you forever, because they were not at any time to be ill-treated. They were not at any time to be beaten. They were not at any time to be abused, because it was strictly against the law. And if you don't believe me, just look at Leviticus chapter 24, verses 24 to 27. If within the period the person was repaying his or her debt, a master, to use that language, hit the person and injured the person, knocked out a tooth or an eye, or caused damage, God said, if you do that, you need to release that person. I don't care how long is left, you need to release that person right away. Just to make it clear that there is no abuse in that system. It is something you entered into voluntarily, and that was a relief mechanism for poverty. And this is why verse 39 is so important in defining the context. And when we come to 44, which I had left behind, 44 comes and says, now let's talk about people who are not Israelites and therefore are not in that covenant. It doesn't apply to them. But if these people decided to become proselytes, if these people decided to become Israelites themselves by religion, then this would apply to them. Are you with me? So we need to keep this clear. So that's the context in the Old Testament of this particular passage in Leviticus 25 that is unique in the Bible. Now, we need to move on to all these other New Testament texts and see what is the context there. So now I invite you to go to Ephesians chapter 6, because we had it before. We had Ephesians 6, verse 5. Now I want you to read verse 5 to 7 for me to establish the context of that, please.
Okay, so Ephesians 6, 5 to 7, and I'm reading from the Revised Standard Version. And it says, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your earthly masters with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart as to Christ, not in the way of eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to men."
Okay, so you can see the context here. This is the Greco-Roman context in which Paul lived in first century Christianity. And the word servant or slave here, if you like, the same word doulos that this person was talking about, has a large semantic range. Depending on context, it has its meaning. And right here, it could be a bond servant. That means somebody who is not a hired servant, like the passage of Leviticus 25 makes the difference between the bond servant and the hired servant, while using the same word, eved. And for the hired servant, he uses the word sakir. Now, what we have here is the doulos that covers all of that. So this text here addresses the two kinds, because doulos covers it. Like we are doulos of God, or douloi, if you put it in plural, we are the douloi of God, the servants of God. So if they pay you, or if they don't pay you, the context here is be honest in what you're doing. Don't work only when people are watching you. Why? Because there is a greater reality in this, and this is you need to give God glory in your own life by being faithful to Him, whether it is in serving others or in serving wherever you are, depending on the circumstances. And verse 7 makes it very clear, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to men. That's why he says, slaves in verse 5, be obedient to those who are your earthly masters. And again, I say this covers all kinds of professional work, help work, or bond servant work. It covers the whole lot. The context is what you do it with a heart that is pleasing to God and not to people. The second text is Colossians 3, verse 25. Please.
For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality.
Okay, so I think we had read the text that was before that to say that people will use this to justify their enslavement to death of people they had bought, they had kidnapped, they had stolen, they had ill-treated, they had done all kinds of things too against their will. Against their will. And this text now stands in the context to say, if you're going to do these things that are wrong, you need to know that God is going to look at everyone the same way. And now, to emphasize that, still in the context, even if it's another chapter, because 25 is the last verse, I believe, of chapter 3, let's see what Colossians 4 verse 1 says, even though we changed chapter, we were still in the same context because the Bible was not written originally with chapters and verses, right? So,
and it says, masters, treat your slave justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven.
knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So, at the beauty of this, God is looking at the masters and saying, I want you to be just like me. To the people under you, to the people who seemingly are in a position where they are subservient to you. Because that's all the word master and slave here, that's all it conveys, that those two words together. It's service and being subservient. And it is used for freemen, for bondmen, for everyone who is in service, including Christians who have given their lives to Christ, servants of Christ, doulos or douloi of Christ. You with me? So you can see Colossians 3:25 goes on to say, masters, don't do wrong. Don't do wrong to your slaves because God has no partiality in him. He is going to treat you the same way he would have treated the slaves if they had done things that were wrong in his eyes. And remember, after all, that down here on this planet, it's not the whole of reality. There is a greater reality, and that greater reality is I am a master over you, so you better be careful. And Jesus is consistent when he says to people generally, what you would want people to do for you, do it for them also. That's what we find here. And that text that Paul is writing here stems from the book of Deuteronomy and from the book of Leviticus, and specifically the passages that we have read. Okay, so this is the context. Now let me have you read another text that we looked at. That was 1 Timothy chapter 6, and we're going to read verses 1. We had only read verse 1. Let's read verse 1, verse 2, and verse 9, please.
Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be defamed. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brethren. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit from their service are believers and beloved. And those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and hurtful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction.
We had only read verse 1, and keep this text here. And that would be the text used to justify the keeping under subjection of all these millions of men, women, and children who had been bought, hunted, sold, kidnapped, stolen, beaten, and all kinds of things that happened to them. These are the texts that they will use, verse 1 again. But verse 2, we are in a context. And
Oh, okay. We're having some connection difficulties with Pedro, but
Holy Spirit
as you,
is
he's come back.
okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you say that again, Pedro? We seem to have lost you partway through.
Well, I don't know where you lost me, so if you can remind me, please.
Yeah, just immediately after the verse was read.
Okay, so what we're saying is in this passage that we're looking at in First Timothy chapter 6. Am I still here with you?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so in this passage that we've just read, we see the larger context of this. And if you can put the text back for me on the screen, please, so that we can look at it and know exactly what we're saying. In verse 2, it says, "Those who are believing masters." What would a believing do? Tell me.
Treat people with respect.
We've just read it in Colossians 4. They were supposed to treat them in the same way God, the master of all, would treat them. It's the same thing that we have in the creation story. When God places man above everything and says, have dominion. The dominion that man is supposed to have over the creation, is it one that would destroy it? Is it one
No.
that would
No.
allow him to satisfy all his desires, as we see in verse 9, to bring destruction on the earth? Or is it one that is specifically attached to the will and character of God, without which the world fall sin and destruction, like it in Genesis 3? You with me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still here.
Yes, we're still here.
So in verse 2, thank you. So in verse 2, those who have believing masters must not be respectful on the ground that they are brethren. What is he addressing? This is what he is saying. This functions this way in the Greco-Roman context, where you have people who work for people, people who serve people, people who are bond servants to other people. If you find yourself in a household like that of Cornelius, for instance, or Cornelius, for instance, who has many servants of that sort, don't think because you are both Christians, you should lack respect for one another. This is the issue that he is addressing in verse 1 when he says, make it so that you are obedient to your master. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So this has absolutely nothing to do with the kind of slavery, again, we say, that we experienced over the last centuries during the slave trade from Europe to Africa and the Americas. Absolutely nothing. Paul is saying, if you find yourself in this situation, remember, both masters and slave, that we live in a greater reality where we respect one another and we care for one another to the glory of God. That's all that he is saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we could go on and on and on and on this, but we will not find anything that deviates from that. Do you have a comment for me on something like property, or because
Yeah, Yeah, a viewer was asking. They were asking, does selling himself remove any moral responsibility you have? You are committing an immoral act if you consider them property, even if they beg to become your property for life. I think Pedro,
Again,
right.
focus on understand the Bible is saying. It's not about being moral or immoral. This attitude here about selling, it is very clear. The selling
Yeah.
here in the Bible is about, let's say me, Pedro, I don't have money. I can't survive. I will go to my brother and say, please take care of me, of my needs and my family, and I will serve you. They call this selling yourself into servitude or into slavery. If you were a Hebrew, that God would not allow that to go beyond 6 years. And he had his own reasons for that, because God is working on the theme of deliverance, which he wanted the Israelite people to preach throughout the world. So he has a covenant with them. God will say, you don't go beyond 6 years. So it's not about being moral. In fact, this was a help to address the issue of
Oh,
poverty.
yeah.
That's right.
Now, within that context, God makes clear to people, even if you, let me tell you something. In Proverbs 22, verse 7, I believe, or around that, the Bible says, commonly speaking, the people who lend you money, they master over you. They just lend money, master over you. Why? Because they have helped you coming out of a situation. They can ask you to do anything. You should not say, I can't do it. We see that in our societies all the time. If you help somebody, you somehow, even if you don't say it clearly, demand that this person may be at your service. You may not express that um, clearly. You may not articulate that, but in your attitude, your relationship, and I'm not saying it's everyone the same, but generally speaking, this is what I have observed. We have this, but goes on to say, look, even if somebody sells himself, if the issue is using the word selling himself, then remove it. But the idea is you need a plan. God has a plan that he uses so that people may not be in situations where they can't help themselves, and people around can help them. But the duty of both is to know that they both are under the command and the leadership of God, therefore, they cannot abuse one another.
Pedro, I think also it's the word property. One of our viewers can't,
Okay, let me
doesn't,
address that.
yeah.
Let me address that. The word property, you will find it um, everywhere. And you will find even when God speaks about the Levites, God says to the Levites, the word property can be used to say property, inheritance, all of that. God says to the Levites, I am your property. I am your inheritance. It's the exact same word. So when again we see this word property, we should not think of it within the context of late last century's slavery that we know of, but we should look at it within the biblical context, even
Yes.
Even within
Yeah.
Leviticus chapter 25, read verse 23. God says to the Israelites, I have given you the land, and it's everywhere in the Bible. I've given you the land for an inheritance. But God goes around and say, but you can't sell it because the land is mine. This is the idea behind God works within the parameters or the context of human beings, but he goes further to remind them that this is not ultimate reality. You may have this system in order to address the issues of social and political and financial difficulties, but I am telling you that beyond that, there is me. And in this particular context, I am the master of everyone, and I do not want anyone to abuse anyone else, regardless of their social, professional, religious, or other status in this life. But the word property here should not be an issue. It's not like it's your table. Therefore, you can cut it, you can break it, you can. No, because we've already established that God says, I'm not partial and I'm not a regarder of person. I do want you to love the stranger and I don't want you to abuse them. So the word property here has nothing to do with what we understand from the different laws that existed at the time of the slave trade from, again, Europe to Africa, the Americans, and the Caribbean, that these people had to say, you are my property. It's not the same thing.
Okay, thank you for that, Pedro, because I think that the viewer had this tension about property and the morality of owning someone, but that was explained quite well. So I'm not sure, EJ, if that was okay, that explanation was okay. But I've got another one for you, Pedro. It's by somebody called Ria. And he said, Pedro, I believe the Old Testament slavery continued in the Greco-Roman Empire. What's your take on that, Pedro? Question
That's
mark.
correct. That's correct. That's correct. That's correct.
There you go,
That's
Ria.
correct.
You've got your question. That's correct.
That's
Short
correct.
and sweet.
So Pedro, you just covered quite a lot. So I just want to go. I don't know if I could read my question again, and if you can somehow summarize, because you went through quite a lot. I'm wondering if I read through my question again, if we can somehow summarize so that we're clear what we're saying on this. So my final question relating to this was, can we say that the Bible does not condone slavery in spite of the text that we read? So if it was to summarize, basically, part two, based on what we've said in part one, the recap, and now what we've added in part two, like how would we address this for someone who's still unsure about the answer to this question?
Well, is still unsure. Someone is changed that person, re-watch it and try to understand with the Bible in hands. But I understand your question. Let me summarize. Yes, we can say that the Bible does not condone slavery if in our minds we are thinking about the slavery that we experienced in the last centuries. Again, I say, where people did not sell themselves in order to alleviate their pain and their suffering from economic hardship. We can say the Bible does not condone slavery because these people were not willing, these people were stolen, these people were hunted, these people were kidnapped, these people were captured, these people were worked to death for generations. These people were abused, and they were their way out most of the time, for the vast majority, was death.
Death.
The Bible does not condone.
No.
But if we're thinking within the biblical context of what we have said, you fall on hard times, you want a way out, your neighbor has the means, you go and work for your neighbor.
Yeah.
Yes, we can say, depending on the situation, you can say the Bible actually encourages and regulates that. Are you with me? That's where it's difficult for people because they can't separate the two. Listen, if the Bible condoned that sort of slavery that we experienced over the last centuries, particularly as people from Africa, then there would be no need for God to exist.
That's right. That's right. And we've got some comments coming in, Pedro. And Ria said, thanks, guys. A lot of information this evening, very informative. And another one, Michael Gwynn, said, what an amazing discussion this fine morning. That sounds so lovely. Everyone has made great points, and the panel is always so supportive and engaging. Thank you, Michael. We appreciate that.
But also, Pedro, I wanted to clarify because, I think part of the issue is that when we talk about the biblical context, we always use the term slavery. But if they were working to kind of like get themselves to a better position, is slavery the right word? Like for example, if you use the word servant, then that's different because we understand that a servant is like for example, we've already discussed this, but we see like Abraham, even back in the times of Abraham, we saw that they had servants, and maids and so forth. And that's like a different language and because they were, like, as you said, they were trying to get themselves back into a better position. So it's as though they were remunerated for that. So maybe slavery is not the right word.
You're right. You're right. And as I said, the problem we have is even within the text of Leviticus, you have two different words. You have the word sakir. The word sakir stands for people who would be hired, a hired servant, right?
Yes.
And then you have the word eved, who could be used also for a hired servant because why? He is serving, right? So he is a servant. And the word eved would be used for everything else, whether it is paid, not paid, and so on and so forth. But the problem we have is we have bondservant. Let me have you read two more texts for me. Can you read for me 1 Corinthians 12, verse 13, quickly, please?
Okay. It says, for by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond nor free, and have all been made to drink into one Spirit.
Okay, and another one quickly, Colossians 3:11. And that will make the conclusion.
Where there is neither Jew nor Greek, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond or free, but Christ is all and in all. Amen.
Amen. We could use the word servants, definitely, because at the end of the day, this is service.
Yes, and thank you, Pedro. We've had a lot of wonderful comments as to how we were doing today. You got Esther D said, thank you, Pedro, because they are trying to set themselves up as God. And then we have Nicole, she goes, excellent study. And as an African American, the text addressed can be difficult to grasp given our history. Thank you for tackling this challenging topic and providing clarity. So I want to viewers, I want to thank you for your lovely comments and your encouragement. We really appreciate it. We'll appreciate it more if you like, share and subscribe and press that notification bell, and that will greatly support us. And we hope that you got something out of it. And as always, remember, the Bible does not condone slavery that is abusing those who are made in the image and divinity of God. That is a man thing brought on by another spirit, which is not of God. So until next time, enjoy your week, and we look forward to seeing you again next week for another study with the biblical perspective. God bless you.